I'm delighted to introduce Thomas O'Loughlin. He's a man who's dedicated his life so far, he's very young, to exploring how Christianity's past shapes today and how it offers us alternative futures. So that's a perfect guest for Root and Branch. Now, when I asked Tom what I could say about him, he emailed, "There's little to say except that I try to explore theological questions in writing." Well, I suppose that's one way of describing Professor Thomas O'Loughlin's impressive body of academic and pastoral work. 15 academic books, his latest called Eating Together, Becoming One, Taking Up Pope Francis's Call to Theologians. Also 9 pastoral books, his latest Washing Feet, Imitating the Example of Jesus in the Liturgy Today, and about 400 articles with the common themes of love, the Eucharist, discipleship, the invisibility of women, Celtic and medieval theology, and he's always hot on actions. Now, Tom is very learned and extremely distinguished. His title is Professor Emeritus of Historical Theology in the University of Nottingham. He took voluntary redundancy last year to save the university some money and to devote himself to other things. But he says that historical theology is not the history of theology, nor is it church history, nor intellectual history, nor even the history of ideas. It's the endeavor to do theology using the experience of the way Christians lived and believed over the centuries to help us make sense of our faith today. He's a polymath. He was a contributor to the development of a community training project for HIV/AIDS sufferers in Kenya from 2002 to 2009. He still provides training for clergy of several Christian denominations. He's a broadcaster, a prolific reviewer for 48 journals, yes, I counted them, and a reader for 22 publishers, including both Cambridge and Oxford University Press. They're 2 different ones. He gave the St. Patrick Lecture at the Irish Seminary Maynooth last year, and he's also, the R&B, the Root and Branch team would be interested to hear, a great organizer of conferences. He organized conferences in Maynooth, Lampeter, Durham, Nottingham, and Iona. And I feel, Tom, we should pick your brains for the Root and Branch Synod in September. But for now, without more ado, I'll hand over to Thomas O'Loughlin. Tom, it's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much, Penelope. The problem, of course, an introduction like that is everything that happens now is going downhill. First of all, it's delightful to be with you today, and it's delightful to know the questions that are animating your presence here. I had a chat with 3 or 4 members of Root and Branch a couple of weeks ago, and I think this idea of going down a synodal path is a wonderful idea, and one that is crucial, not just to the renewal of the church, but indeed to the survival of Christianity today. One of the issues about the word synodality is that it's come out of nowhere in Catholic discourse. 10 years ago, if you had used the word synodality, people would say, oh yeah, it's an Anglican idea, isn't it? Or if they were if they didn't know the Anglicans, say, yeah, it's a very Eastern Orthodox idea, isn't it? Synodality has not been a major theme in Western Christianity since indeed of 1415. That was the last time we took it seriously, and it ended in the burning of theologians. Indeed, probably the greatest theologian of the early 15th century, John Huss, died because the idea of synodality was threatening equally to the papacy and to the empire. So it's 700 years since we've been playing with this idea. And what I want to do today is I just want to not even try to define it, because it's too complex to define, but just to see how radically different synodality is to the way most of us were brought up to think. Now, one of the one of the questions that only arises when one's speaking to a group of Catholics, and particularly Roman Catholics, Western Catholics, is that we have running in our heads two different pictures of the church. And we're never quite sure which one should be dominant. Now that doesn't affect the Eastern churches, and it certainly doesn't affect the churches of the Reformation. If you speak to a group of Welsh Presbyterians, they're very much aware that they belong to one church, and just down the road there's the Welsh Independents, and just down the road there's another group, and just down the road there's another group again. And indeed, they will actually be aware of the fact that they will often move between those groups. But Catholics have a choice between thinking of the church from the ground up or from the top down. Now, most Catholics, when they hear the word the Catholic Church, think top down. You think Pope Francis, you're part of a big universal organization. It's a world church. There's an advert, there's a little article on La Croix International, the English version, the last week. Statistics show the Catholic Church grew by so many million people. Interestingly, it didn't say a particular community grew or particular churches grew or we planted new churches. It was just one sack, one sample. Just as the census will tell you how many people is in a state, so we tend to think of the church as a supranational single entity, and then we work downwards within that. And your local parish is, as it were, the local branch. So I bank with Lloyd's. Lloyd's is a single entity, and I know that wherever I plug in my card, my money will come out from a Lloyd's bank, but there's a local branch nearby, and that's just merely where I connect. It's merely the interface with the big entity called Lloyd's Bank. Now, where did the idea of a world church come from? Well, certainly in the earliest centuries, there is a sense that there is an oikumene. There is the oikumene, which is the empire, and then there is the oikumene, that is the links between all the churches. So all our early documents talk about networks. They're almost like sinews. So for instance, let's take the word apostle. An apostle is someone who is a sinew sent from one church to another. Now, let's leave aside this whole question about how many there were. There were thousands of them. And St. Paul, at the end of the letter to the Romans, talks about Junia, whom he considers a woman, the first among the apostles. And we know of the names of some men apostles, we know the names of some female apostles, and we know husband and wife teams, Priscilla and Aquila, and they form the links. An apostle is someone sent away from one church to be the representative of another. Curiously, when we think of the word apostle, we think of it in terms of a command structure. There's Jesus, the 12, then the bishops, and on down the line. And so we will emphasize, for instance, to an extent that most churches just don't emphasize, this idea of apostolic succession. Are you plugged into the mains that run all the way back, and they run to one particular point? The immediate aspect of emphasizing the universality of the church is that you emphasize that it has an interchangeable ministry. So at the center of the clerical myth is the idea that they're operatives in one church. You can interchange them. You can pull someone out of one place and put them into another. it's very deep in our psyche. We used to justify the fact that all popes were Italian on the basis, this was in the 1970s. I remember a man who taught ecclesiology saying, well, the reason the Pope always has to be Italian is that, of course, he's primarily the Bishop of Rome, and it's fitting that since Rome is an Italian city, it should have an Italian. But the idea is that you could pull popes from anywhere, and historically we have. I have heard bishops saying, in all seriousness, thank God for India, they can supply us with all our priests. I've heard bishops in Australia saying, thank God for Vietnam, or thank God for the Philippines, they can supply us. And so we've moved people around, and this was seen as an incredibly good thing because it strengthened the notion that wherever you were, you went into the building and it was merely the representative of one church. So oneness was singularity, not unity, singularity. We prayed at the beginning for the ordination of women. Interesting word. We didn't say that they would be able to take place in all the ministry of the church, but they would be able to be ordained. Why do we use a term from the Roman Empire to describe ministry? The Roman Empire relied on an incredibly efficient universal civil service. They were known as the Ordo. They weren't terribly well paid. They weren't great landowners, but they kept the show on the road because they could be moved, and we have instances. You could be on the northern reaches of Britain, freezing one year, and you could be out in the deserts in Mesopotamia the next year, and they were interchangeable. The Ordo was answerable to itself, and the Ordo had many privileges. For instance, it had access to free post office. The imperial mail was open to anyone who was a member of the Ordo. So it didn't matter whether you were sending the tax returns from Cumbria to Rome, or you were sending a message to your brother who was also in the Ordo, but operating at the first cataract at Syene in the southern limits of the empire. You could send a message. And many of the letters have survived. Most of the priests, male and women, sacerdos is an epicene word, of the imperial cult temples. So not local temples, but people like temples of Mars, temples of Vesta, and of course ultimately temples of Jupiter. Those priests, known by such titles as pontifices or flamines, they were considered to be equal to the Ordo, even though they weren't technically civil servants. They wore the same uniform as the Ordo, a purple long ankle-length gown, and they got some of the privileges of the Ordo. So, for instance, if you were a flamen of the cult of Jupiter, you could use the imperial postage. By 306, ministers in the church were ceasing to call themselves presbyters and were beginning to call themselves sacerdotes. In fact, most Latin theologians can't make a distinction between the fact that a bishop is a sacerdos, a presbyter is a sacerdos, because why did they move to this word? The letter to the Hebrews says there's only one sacerdos in Christianity, one hieros, Jesus. And the one thing the letter to the Hebrews is very clear on is his priesthood is so unique, it cannot be shared with anyone, but it can be shared with all the baptized. Well, why did we start using the word sacerdos, priest, sogat in Irish? Every language has some equivalent to the word priest, sacerdos. because in 306, a group of clergy in Spain decided that one of the things they wanted was to be considered to be equivalent in rank to the ordo. Now, obviously, free postage, reduced travel expenses, all that, you can't, who could blame them? But the price they paid for that was that they saw themselves not as servants to local communities, but part of an international organization designed to deliver a service. So when we use the word ordination, let's remember it's not a healthy word. Being a minister, diaconia, is a healthy word. And if we start thinking in terms of the whole church, then the next thing we do is we get a map and we divide it up into areas, and we then say, well, how many people have we fitted to that area? Well, finding bishops is never a problem. There's umpteen people with greasy hands who want to climb the pole. I've known little boys of 17 and 18 in seminaries, and they were already thinking what they would look like in a mitre. But what it means is that you then divide the diocese, you divide the world into dioceses, and then you divide the diocese into parishes, and then you pop in people. Their connection with the local community is that they're providing a service. They quite literally are like the local bank manager. Local bank manager isn't too worried about me. His primary obligation is to Lloyd's Bank. And his only relationship to me is, in representing Lloyd's Bank, he presents me with a service which he knows I want or am expected to want. So vocations becomes a matter of logistics. And in fact, we have now got the bizarre situation in the Catholic Church that we think there can be a shortage of vocations, because a shortage of volunteers to work in the Sacra Ordo, the sacred order, equals the inability of the Holy Spirit to inspire people. Now, that is a vision that is so deeply within us. We hear someone saying, well, I'm a Catholic. They don't say, I'm a member of this community. They usually designate themselves first and foremost in terms of the worldwide vision. Now let's actually look at the way human beings operate. Because if we're going to talk about synodality, we're actually going to say that one doesn't start at the universal, one starts at the local, and then the local meets the next local, and that's where the two roads come together. So synodality presupposes that I'm in one group, you're in another, and these two groups are going to interface in some way. So the moment we start talking about synodality, we have to move out of the top-down universalist model. And I must say, at the moment, I'm very fearful when I hear the bishops in Australia are having a synod. I hear the bishops in Ireland are having a synod. The Pope is talking about synodality. There's going to be a synod on synodality, but it's going to be a synod on synodality with representatives of all the different branches. I'm not sure they realize that this means, if synodality means anything, they have to start abandoning the top-down model. And it could be that after a couple of years of talking of synodality, this will just fizzle out as the greatest waste of time that we have engaged in. Because I know several bishops who are dropping the word synodality into everything they're writing, yet I know they haven't thought it through for 1 second, because it's not part of their world. They're universalists. They Their logic is totally, I'm Rome directed, I'm Rome's man here. I know one guy who's actually in the same letter, which I read just a few weeks ago, described himself as the Pope's representative, using the language of, the actual pastoral government, the jargon of the law books. And yet he's talking about promoting synodality. This is quite literally like Turkey's talking about how they're looking forward to Christmas. And I think we have to try and grasp how different the synodal model is. Where do you start to try and grasp the synodal model? The usual place that Christians start is with New Testament communities or with the community of the Didache or something like that. That's actually a very useful place to start because we know so little about the mechanisms of those. It's far better to start by starting with the anthropologists and looking at how human beings come together. Now, the place I suggest you start is with a professor of evolutionary anthropology in Oxford called Professor Robin Dunbar. And Dunbar has put forward a piece of research that looks at the structure of and size of the differing brains of the primates. So he begins with animals like baboons, then he moves up to the gorillas, then he moves to the chimpanzees, and the bonobos, and finally humans. And the strange thing is the size of the group that we can interact with is tied to brain size. Now, don't ask me to go in and prove the maths. I read his papers and I see the maths, and when I see three root signs multiplying one another, the shutters come down. But the reality is this: you can actually relate to about 150 people. Now, 150 people is actually a maximum. Many people can't relate to that. And then you come down and you realize that 80% of your time is spent relating to an even smaller group, usually less than a dozen. So think about husbands, wives, partners, children, maybe grandchildren, and think of how much time you spend in the service of that group. And the answer is about 80% is spent on an immediate group of between 5 and 10 people. Now, there are some people who can relate to far more, but there's almost no one that can relate to more than 150. So what we actually find ourselves in is that you, and I'm looking at 25 different faces on the screen now, and I know I could extend that to 4 screens. Each of you is at a center of about 150 people, and you're also at the center of a cluster. And so we're constantly clustering, and there are intense places of overlap. Some of these are called the local football club, the local group that does this. Partly it's your extended family, partly it's the locality, but it's also the group in which we witness to God through Jesus Christ. So to think of a church that is more than 150 people is to effectively talk human nonsense. A church of more than 150 people just doesn't work. It will break into smaller sections. And it's these real groupings that form the bedrock of the church. It's within that grouping that we can engage in the most primitive human activity, which is eating together. We're meal sharing animals. And so we eat together. And when we gather to eat together, the appropriate thing of that is to thank God. So we don't gather for Mass, we gather to eat, and then gathering to eat, we become Eucharistic. We're emerging out of the lockdown, and I know that one of the questions that's being asked in many dioceses is, how do we get people back to Mass? That's a back to front question. If you're now I'm only going to speak to the people in England for a moment, excuse everyone else. How many of you were delighted yesterday to know you could just get back out and meet people? Now, I know we can only meet outdoors and we can only meet in small groups, but we're all great. We're delighted to actually get back to meet people. There are people actually delighted just to get the shops open again. Human beings are naturally gregarious. We love meeting up with one another. We love eating together. We love drinking together. And one of the things I'll try to do, if I remember, and I'm going to make a note of it now, is I'm going to send you an article by Dunbar on why we love to drink together. There was a guy so desperate to get out and have a pint, he was shown on the television last night drinking a pint and the snow falling on him in Oxford. Now, at one level, that's crazy. But as a Christian, I'm delighted. Hey, it shows the divine programming is still operative. So we shouldn't be worried. How do you get people back to Mass? I know that in one diocese, this is being discussed in the next couple of days. What you do is you say, how, when people gather, do we help them to be Eucharistic together? Now, that you see, now I'm starting on the ground and I'm building up. So in that case, one of the things you need to help them to be Eucharistic is there are some people who naturally have the gift of being able to organize other human beings, that when they get together, they all row together and they don't fight with one another and they don't just sit in their corners. They actually start sharing and building together and working together. And it's identifying those people who've been skilled by the Holy Spirit in their humanity, that they will now have this transfinalized so that it's helping their brothers and sisters grow in grace. And identifying those people, that's what identifying vocation is. Not praying that we get more people going into seminaries or more youngsters running around in collars, whether the youngsters are boys or girls. So what then does that do to our vision? Well, if we think of the church really as beginning in real communities, there'll always be less than 150 people, where we're actually trying to find the skills within the community that can be actualized and named within the network of communities, within the synodal network. That would be the equivalent of the laying on of hands. Notice I'm avoiding that word ordination. The way we recognize one another's skills is through the laying on of hands. And then that is built outwards so that we don't talk about one church, but we talk about how all the churches form a unity. We're not a singularity with branches. We're real churches who are coming into unity together because we actually synodally move together. We are part of this larger vision of the kingdom, which allows real communities to build the kingdom of God. And in the language of Luke, for that set of kingdom building activities to move out from Jerusalem to all Judea, out to the ends of the earth. We could rephrase it from individual communities who network and come into unity, and then it spreads outwards. So when we hear the word Catholic, if I were very technical, I'd say, right, everyone write down what word comes into your head when you hear the word Catholic. Western Christians, and particularly Roman Catholics, they'll always write universal. Catholic equals universal. So how's it different to the word ecumenical? Doesn't that mean, oh yeah, that means universal as well. Now, the word Catholic means universal, but it also has another meaning, and that is, it means integrity. So we don't become Catholic because we're all one. We become Catholic because each of these communities has its own integrity. It is the genuine integrity of being a church. And then forming into unity, the whole group has a certain integrity in its witness to Jesus Christ. So if synodality really takes off, it is going to be the largest change in the Western Church since the beginning of the 4th century. I hope and pray it does. But such revolutions are going to be. The level of psychological resistance just can't be underestimated. Again, I was looking at either the Tablet or some magazine the last week or so, and I was looking at the number of bishops around the world who are already just they're beginning to get cold feet. Think of your own parish. Is it really a community, or is it an administrative division? Your parish priest, does he like the idea that he is the religious expert? For instance, he's not entitled to wear purple. We've reserved that to the real members of the order, the bishops and the monsignori. Does he like to think of himself, though, as the man apart? He may say, oh, well, of course, the priesthood, and you can give all sorts of theological, beautiful reasons about, I am among you as one who serves, and you can dress it all up. But if synodality really takes root in the Catholic Church, it's going to change everything. And I'm not sure how many people at the moment prattling about it have really realized that it's a movement. You start with a real community, which becomes a real church, which then meets another church and recognizes that they are then members, not of a universal organization, but of Christ. And I hope, having run over my time and having run down the lines, dropping hand grenades to the left and right of me with aplomb, that I've left you with some interesting questions. And I'm going to try and join you tomorrow at 2 o'clock. But if I don't make it, I hope that the hand grenades will still be going off in 24 hours time. So
thank you very much, Tom. Yep, the hand grenades are very useful, very helpful. We might have to get rid of our name, Root and Branches, because now I'm thinking of Lloyd's Bank and nothing else. But we'll hold on to it. But what we began as was a small community. We are still limited by Zoom to 100, so we're doing okay there. We can't get bigger than 150, clearly. No, but I think what we're trying to do, and we're listening to you, and we will take in everything that you've said about trying to start our synod in Bristol, is that we are a small community meeting another community. You've got people from Canada, from America, from Poland, and that's exactly what you're advising us to do, is to be small within ourselves and to have our own integrity, and then to meet with each other and support each other. So we will be picking your brains along the way. I know that you have agreed to be part of our synod in September in some way. And thank you just so very much. And just one thing, one of your close friends who's here today and who's Zoomed with us already, John O'Loughlin Kennedy, I asked him about you, what to say. And he said that you were a very modest man, but incredibly bright, and asked creative questions and came up with creative responses. What I don't think I knew until I was preparing to introduce you is that you are indeed a presbyter yourself. That is the word you use.
Yes,
I didn't even know it. I've chatted with you so many times, well, a few times before, and I had no idea. So there you are. You are a wonderful example of a human being. Thank you.